On the 12th of June, 1889, 10 railway carriages packed with Sunday school children stood motionless on a hillside in County Armagh, and then, without warning, they began to roll backward. There was no storm that morning. There was no fire, no flood, no act of God. The sky over Armagh was clear and the sun was warm, one of the finest mornings of that early summer. 80 people, most of them children, on a single day out to the seaside, would not go home that evening. 19 of them were under the age of 15. A further 27 were barely older than that. Well over half the dead had not yet reached 20 years old. There was no earthquake, and there was no act of terrorism. There was only a train, divided in two on a hill, held by nothing more than a handbrake, with no one sent back down the line to give warning. It remains to this day the worst railway disaster in the history of Ireland, and one of the worst in the history of these islands. Yet outside the city of Armagh itself, where it is still quietly remembered every June, it has largely slipped from national memory. It did not have to happen. Every failure that produced it had already been named in writing 11 years before a single wheel began to turn that morning. To understand how a church outing to the coast became the deadliest few minutes in the story of British and Irish railways, you have to go back to the ordinary, unremarkable town the excursion set out from, and to a decision made in an office years earlier to leave a known danger unfixed. Before we go on, this channel is only just getting started, and stories like this one are exactly what it exists to tell properly and carefully. If that is something you would like more of, take a moment to subscribe so the next one reaches you. And if you have a moment, leave a like, and whatever corner of the world you happen to be watching this from, I would love to know. Tell me in the comments. To understand what happened on that hillside outside Armagh, you first have to understand what Armagh was. In 1889, it was a small cathedral city in the north of Ireland, home to 2 cathedrals, both dedicated to St. Patrick, one Church of Ireland, one Roman Catholic, standing on facing hills above the town, as though the town itself had been built to hold them. It was not an industrial city. It was a market town, a place of a few thousand people, serving the farms and villages of the surrounding county. Its rhythms were the rhythms of a provincial Victorian town: church bells, market days, and the coming and going of the railway that had, within living memory, connected it to the rest of Ireland, and through the ports to the rest of the world. That railway was the Great Northern Railway of Ireland, and it mattered enormously to a town like Armagh. It was how goods left the county, and how people arrived in it. It was also, for families who otherwise rarely travelled further than the next parish, the means by which an entire community could for one day a year reach the sea. The Armagh Methodist Sunday School's annual excursion to Warrenpoint was exactly that kind of day. Warrenpoint sat on Carlingford Lough, a resort town of promenades and sea air, and for the children of Armagh, most of whom had never seen the coast, the trip was the single, most anticipated day of the year. It was organised, as it had been in previous years, by men well known in the town. Surgeon Major John Lynn, a retired army officer, active in the life of the church, helped organise it. So did Robert Gillespie, a local justice of the peace, and J.E. Peel, a solicitor. The Sunday school superintendent, Samuel Steele, oversaw the arrangements directly. Steele would travel with the excursion himself, along with members of his own family. On the morning of the 12th of June, a military band led the excursionists from Abbey Street down to Armagh railway station. Children walked in their best clothes, carrying picnic baskets, buckets and spades, the small equipment of a seaside day that, for many of them, came only once a year. Parents walked alongside them. The mood, by every account, was festive. It was a warm morning, and Warrenpoint, with its beach and its lough and its promenade, was waiting at the other end of the line. What none of those families in their best clothes could have known was that the railway carrying them that day was operating with almost none of the safety equipment that the Board of Trade in London already considered essential. Of the 518 miles of track the Great Northern Railway of Ireland operated, Only 23 miles used what was called the block system, a method of signalling that keeps trains a safe distance apart by controlling which train is allowed into which section of track at any one time. The company had no locomotive and no carriage anywhere on its network fitted with an automatic continuous brake, the one piece of equipment that more than any other would come to define what went wrong that day. In the whole of Ireland in 1889, only a single engine and 6 vehicles were fitted with that kind of brake. This was not an oversight no one had noticed. It was a warning that had already been given and already ignored. In 1878, 11 years before the Armagh excursion, an official report into an earlier accident on the Great Northern Railway of Ireland recommended, in plain terms, that the company adopt automatic continuous brakes across its passenger trains. The distinction between an automatic brake and the kind the company continued to use matters, and it is worth understanding clearly because it is the single mechanical fact at the centre of everything that follows. A non-automatic brake, the kind fitted to the Armagh excursion train, works by admitting air or releasing vacuum to apply pressure to the brake. If a train comes apart, a coupling fails, or a section becomes disconnected, that brake does not engage. It can simply fail open, releasing rather than holding. An automatic brake works the opposite way round. It is held off by vacuum or pressure, and any loss of that vacuum, whether from a driver's deliberate action or from an accidental separation, causes the brakes to apply immediately and hold. One system fails dangerous, the other fails safe. By 1889, the safer of the two had existed, been tested, and been formally recommended to this company in writing for over a decade. The Great Northern Railway of Ireland had not fitted it. That warning of 1878 sat in the company's own records for a decade while nothing changed. The cost of retrofitting automatic brakes across an entire fleet was significant, and the Great Northern Railway of Ireland, like many companies of its era, chose to wait. Nothing in the years between forced the issue. No inspector arrived to compel it. No law existed that could. Under the railway regulation of the day, the recommendations of the Board of Trade carried moral weight and professional authority, but not the force of statute. A company could read a warning, agree with it in principle, and still decline to act, and face no penalty for declining. That gap between what was known to be safer and what was legally required is the space in which the events of the 12th of June 1889 took shape. The excursion train assembled that morning was, on paper, a modest undertaking. In practice, it was not. The Sunday school had planned for around 800 passengers, a number that would already have made for a long train on a demanding stretch of line. On the day itself, the crowd that gathered at Abbey Street and walked down to the station was larger than planned. Latecomers and extra families swelled the numbers past 900, filling not only the ordinary carriages, but the guards' compartments and the luggage vans as well. Contemporary estimates place the true number close to 940 souls, packed into around 15 vehicles, coupled behind a single locomotive. That locomotive was a modest engine, of a type known as a 240, adequate for many duties on the network, but not obviously suited to hauling a train of that length and that weight up the steep gradient that lay just beyond Armagh station, on the line toward Newry and, beyond it, Warren Point. The man assigned to drive it that morning was Thomas McGrath, a driver with limited experience on this particular stretch of track. McGrath looked at the size of the train behind him, understood the climb ahead, and did something that ought to have stopped the day in its tracks before it began. He asked for a second engine. An assistant locomotive, coupled either ahead or at the rear, would have given the train the additional power it needed to take the gradient without difficulty, and would have removed at a stroke the entire chain of decisions that followed. It was a reasonable request from the one man on the footplate who could feel, in the weight of the train behind him, that something was wrong. The station master at Armagh, responsible for the train's departure, did not provide it. The excursion was allowed to leave without the extra engine McGrath had asked for, carrying more passengers than it had been planned to carry, up a hill it had not been given the power to climb. The train pulled out of Armagh at around 10:15 that morning, the band's music fading behind it, and began the climb toward the summit of the gradient. For a time it made the ascent as expected, moving at perhaps 10 miles an hour, slow but steady. Then, roughly 200 yards short of the top of the climb, the locomotive could pull no further. The train stalled, its wheels no longer able to drag the loaded carriages up the remaining slope. 940 people came to a halt on the side of a hill on a single track, with a stationary train and a working timetable that had another train, the regular scheduled service to Armagh, already on its way up the same line behind them. The man who took charge of what happened next was not the driver and not the station master, but James Elliott, a chief clerk with the company who was travelling with the excursion in an operational capacity. Faced with a stalled train and a following service somewhere down the line, Elliott made a decision that would be picked apart in exhaustive detail by an official inquiry within the month. He ordered the train divided. The front portion, roughly 5 carriages, would be uncoupled from the rest and hauled forward, alone, to the next station, at Hamilton's Bourne, a little over 2 miles ahead. The locomotive would then return for the remaining 10 carriages left behind on the hill. It was, in isolation, not an unreasonable idea. Dividing an overloaded train to get a struggling locomotive over a difficult section was a known practice on Victorian railways. What made the decision fatal was not the division itself, but everything that was not done around it. No one was sent back down the line, on foot or by any other means, to warn the approaching scheduled service that a portion of the excursion train would shortly be standing, unprotected, on the same track. No detonators were placed on the rails behind the stranded carriages, the standard method of the day for warning an oncoming train of danger ahead. And the 10 carriages left standing on the incline, carrying several hundred people, most of them children, were held in place by nothing more than the ordinary handbrake in the guard's van at the rear. That handbrake was the responsibility of Thomas Henry, the rear guard. Whether Henry set the brake fully, or whether it was set but proved insufficient for the weight and the gradient, would become one of the central questions of the inquiry that followed. What is not in dispute is that Henry left the brake van shortly afterward, before the front portion of the train had been safely drawn away, and before there was any certainty that the carriages behind him would hold. There was one further detail, small in itself, that would matter enormously in the minutes that followed. Many of the excursion's passengers had been locked into their compartments before departure, in keeping with a common practice of the day intended to prevent people falling from moving trains, but one the Board of Trade had already discouraged. On an ordinary journey, it made little difference. On a hillside, in carriages about to run away with no working brake, it meant that hundreds of people, children among them, had no means of getting out, even if they had understood, in time, what was beginning to happen around them. The front portion of the train began to move away toward Hamilton's Bourne a short while later. As the locomotive took up the strain and pulled forward, it produced a jolt that ran backward through the couplings to the carriages still standing on the hill. It was a small thing, an ordinary shudder of the kind that happens whenever a train under load first begins to move. On this occasion, it was enough. The 10 rear carriages, held by a handbrake already under more strain than it had been designed for, began to slip. For a moment, perhaps, the movement was almost imperceptible, a few inches of drift on the gradient. Then gravity took hold in earnest. The carriages began to roll backward, away from the summit, back down the slope the train had spent the last quarter of an hour struggling to climb. Inside the guard's van, Thomas Henry felt the floor begin to move beneath him. He would later describe the sensation of the carriages gathering pace, the hedges alongside the line becoming a blur, the train moving faster than any brake van should ever move on its own. There was no engine attached to the rear portion any longer. Nothing pulling, nothing to check it, only the weight of several hundred people and 10 carriages of Victorian rolling stock obeying the slope of the hill. Within the carriages themselves, many locked from the outside, passengers who moments earlier had been settled for what they believed was a brief pause on the way to the coast felt the unmistakable, sickening sensation of a train rolling the wrong way. Some understood immediately what was happening. Others did not, until the speed made it impossible to mistake. The runaway carriages travelled back down the line for close to 1.5 miles. In that distance, with nothing to slow them, they reached a speed later estimated by the Board of Trade's own inspector at somewhere between 30 and 40 miles an hour, a speed that ordinary wooden-bodied Victorian carriages, built for the modest pace of branch-line travel, were never designed to withstand in a collision. Coming the other way, on the same single line, was the scheduled morning passenger service from Armagh, an entirely separate train carrying ordinary travellers with no connection to the Sunday school outing, moving forward at a cautious 5 miles an hour as it approached the section where the excursion train had earlier stalled. Its driver had no warning that anything was wrong. No detonator had sounded on the line ahead. No signal had been altered. There was nothing in front of him but the ordinary curve of the track, and then without warning, 10 runaway carriages bearing down on him at closing speed. The two trains met head-on. The impact was concentrated on the two rearmost vehicles of the runaway portion, which were destroyed in the collision, their wreckage thrown down an embankment some 45 feet in height beside the line. The sound of the collision carried across the surrounding countryside, audible to people working in fields some distance from the track, who would later say they knew at once, from the sound alone, that something terrible had happened on the line. 80 people died in those few seconds on the hillside outside Armagh. 260 more were injured, some seriously. Of the dead, 19 were children under the age of 15. A further 27 were between 15 and 20 years old. Samuel Steele, the Sunday school superintendent who had helped organise the outing, was among those killed, along with members of his own family who had travelled with him that morning. Word reached Armagh within the hour, carried by anyone who could run or ride to raise the alarm. Off-duty railwaymen, clergy, and ordinary townspeople made their way out to the site of the collision, some on foot, some by whatever cart or trap could be found at short notice. What they found at the foot of the embankment was wreckage scattered across the field below the line, and among it the injured and the dead of a train that had left Armagh station less than an hour before, full of children in their best clothes. Surgeon Major John Lynn, one of the excursion's own organisers, was among those who reached the scene early and worked to help the injured. He would later describe what he saw there in terms that were widely reported in the following days. In no part of the kingdom, he said, had ever such an overwhelming calamity occurred. Many a bitter battlefield, he added, did not display such loss. The Belfast Morning News, reporting from the scene, described husbands searching among the injured for their wives, and parents moving from one stretcher to the next, looking for their own children among the survivors and the dead. The injured were carried by whatever means could be found to Armagh Infirmary, which was quickly overwhelmed by the scale of what had arrived at its doors. Doctors and nurses worked through the day and into the evening. In the town itself, the ordinary business of a Wednesday came to a halt. As the scale of the disaster became clear, family by family, name by name. Because the excursion had been organised through the Sunday school, an unusually large proportion of the town's population had some direct connection to those who had travelled that morning, a parent, a cousin, a neighbour's child. There were few households in Armagh that did not know, personally, someone who had been on that train. In the aftermath, a public relief fund was raised for the injured and the bereaved, and the money it collected went, in part, toward a new ward at Armagh Infirmary, the hospital that had treated so many of the survivors on the day itself. It was one of the few immediate, tangible responses the town itself could make to a disaster whose true cause lay not in the town at all, but in a decade-old decision, made far away not to fit a safer break. The scale of the disaster meant that within days it was the subject of national and Irish press coverage, far beyond Armagh, reported as, at that point, the worst railway accident in the history of the United Kingdom. That attention brought with it an inquiry, opened almost immediately, into exactly how 940 people, bound for a day at the seaside, had come to be involved in a head-on collision on a hillside outside their own town. The official inquiry was led by Major General C.S. Hutchinson, a railway department inspector for the Board of Trade, the standard authority called upon to examine serious accidents on Britain and Ireland's railways. Hutchinson's investigation moved quickly, and it moved in exhaustive detail, examining the locomotive assigned that morning, the loading of the train, the condition of the handbrake, the actions of every member of staff involved from the moment the excursion left Armagh station to the moment the two trains met on the line. His conclusion, when it came, was unambiguous. The disaster, Hutchinson found, was in all human probability preventable. Had the excursion train been fitted with an automatic continuous brake, rather than the non-automatic type the company had continued to use. He identified culpable negligence at several points along the chain of decisions that morning. In the locomotive department at Dundalk, which had assigned an engine inadequate to the load. In driver Thomas McGrath, whose request for a second engine had gone unmet. In both guards on the train, William Moorhead at the front and Thomas Henry at the rear. And in James Elliott, the chief clerk whose decision to divide the train, without sending any warning back down the line, had set the runaway carriages in motion. A coroner's inquest, sitting separately, reached its own conclusion 9 days after the disaster, on the 21st of June. 3 men were committed for trial on charges of manslaughter. James Elliott, as the man who had given the order to divide the train, was the most prominent of them. He was tried in Dublin in August of that year. The jury could not agree on a verdict. He was tried again in October, and this time he was acquitted. The charges against the other 2 men were subsequently dropped. No one was ever convicted for what happened on that hillside. 80 people had died. A formal inquiry had found culpable negligence at multiple levels of the company's operation, and yet the individual accountability that the inquest and the courts had been asked to deliver simply did not arrive. It is a difficult, unsatisfying fact, and it was exactly as difficult and unsatisfying to the people of Armagh at the time as it sounds now. But there was a second thread running underneath the criminal proceedings, one that mattered more, in the end, than any single verdict could have. It emerged clearly during Hutchinson's investigation that this was not simply a case of a company making a poor judgment on one particular morning. The Great Northern Railway of Ireland had been told, formally, in writing, 11 years earlier, that its braking system was inadequate and should be replaced. That warning had come after an earlier accident, had been considered by the company and had not been acted upon. By the morning of the 12th of June 1889, the company had had more than a decade to fit the one piece of equipment that would have stopped 10 carriages from rolling backward down a hill with no way to check them, and had chosen, year after year, not to spend the money required to do it. That fact reframed the entire disaster in the minds of the inspectors, the press, and eventually Parliament itself. This had not been an unforeseeable accident. It had been a known risk clearly documented, carried for 11 years by a company that judged the cost of prevention greater than the cost of continuing as it was. And it was not, Hutchinson's report made clear, a failing unique to one Irish railway company. Automatic brakes, block signalling, and the interlocking of points and signals were all recommended as best practice by the Board of Trade in 1889, and none of them were compulsory anywhere in the United Kingdom. What had happened at Armagh could, in principle, have happened on almost any line in Britain or Ireland, still running without them. Parliament did not treat that finding as an abstraction. Within roughly 10 weeks of the collision, the Regulation of Railways Act 1889 passed into law, coming into force on the 30th of August that year. For the first time, it gave the Board of Trade the power to compel every passenger railway company in the United Kingdom to adopt 3 specific safeguards, not as recommendations but as legal requirements. The first was the automatic continuous brake itself, the exact piece of equipment whose absence had let 10 carriages roll unchecked down a hillside outside Armagh. Every passenger train would now be required to carry a brake that applied itself, rather than one that could fail open. The second was the block system of signalling, ensuring that only one train could occupy a given section of line at any time, removing the possibility of a stalled or divided train sharing a stretch of track with a service running up behind it, unannounced. The third was the interlocking of points and signals, a mechanical safeguard ensuring that signals and track junctions could never be set in a configuration that would allow 2 trains to collide. Individually, each of these had already existed in some form, in some places before 1889. What changed in the 10 weeks after Armagh was that they became compulsory, enforceable, and universal. Not a matter of one company's judgment about what it could afford, but a legal floor beneath which no railway, in Britain or Ireland, was permitted to fall. Historians of the railways have since pointed to Armagh as the moment the safety of the passenger railway shifted decisively from voluntary best practice, adopted or ignored at each company's discretion, to a standard enforced by the state. The practical effect reached far beyond the specific line outside Armagh. Every railway company in the country, whatever its size, whatever its finances, was now required to do what the Great Northern Railway of Ireland had been asked, and had declined to do for 11 years. The automatic brake that clamps on the instant a coupling fails, the signal box that will not allow 2 trains into the same section of track, the interlocked lever that makes it mechanically impossible to set points and signals into a collision, all of these became, from the autumn of 1889 onward, the basic and unbroken grammar of how a railway in this country is run. They remain so today on every passenger train that leaves every station in Britain, built upon principles first made compulsory in the 10 weeks that followed the deaths of 80 people on a hillside outside Armagh. The line that carried the excursion train that morning continued in operation for several more decades before finally closing in 1933, and today no train runs on the stretch of track between Armagh and the site where the 2 trains met. The rails themselves are gone, the embankment given back to farmland, and a visitor to the spot today would find little to mark what happened there beyond the quiet of the countryside itself. In the city of Armagh, though, the disaster has never been allowed to fade into an unmarked field. For well over a century, the town held the memory of the 12th of June privately, in family stories and in the records of the Methodist circuit that had organised the outing in the first place. It was not until the 12th of June 2014, the 125th anniversary of the disaster, that Armagh unveiled its first permanent public memorial to the 80 people who died. It stands on the Mall, the city's principal green space, a bronze sculpture of a young girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, dressed in the clothes of the period, barefoot, carrying a bucket and a spade, exactly the small equipment of a child setting off for a day at the seaside that never came. It was commissioned at a cost of around £25,000, funded to ensure that a disaster largely unknown outside County Armagh would nonetheless never be forgotten within it. Every year since, on the Sunday nearest the 12th of June, a remembrance gathering is held in the city, drawing descendants of those who died, members of the Methodist community that organised the original excursion, and residents of a town that has never treated this as a piece of distant history. In recent years, some local historians and academics have gone further, calling for a second memorial, one placed not in the city centre, but at the actual site of the collision itself, arguing that the field beside the old embankment deserves its own marker, distinct from the sculpture on the mall. As things stand, the town remembers. The hillside, for now, does not. Among the names read aloud at that gathering each year are families who did not simply lose one member that morning, but were, in some cases, lost together in the space of a single collision. The Cleland family, James and Margaret and 3 of their children, Charles, Samuel and Robert, travelled together on the excursion and died together on the hillside. 2 sisters, Isabella and Bertha McFarland, aged 22 and 20, are remembered together on the same day each June. So are Margaret and Mary Jane Mason, and Mary and Jane Orr, and a young couple's infant son, William, not yet 3 years old, who died alongside his parents. These are not names widely known outside County Armagh, but in Armagh itself they are read aloud, year after year, precisely so that they are not reduced to a single total. For the Methodist congregation itself, the loss could not be set apart from the ordinary life of the Sunday school that had organised the outing. So many of its own children and families had been lost in a single morning that the 12th of June became, from that year onward, a date the congregation could not simply pass over, one that would in time be marked publicly and formally, long after those who had stood on Abbey Street that morning were gone. When James Elliot was acquitted in October of 1889, the verdict was received in Armagh with a bitterness that outlasted the trial itself by generations. The town had watched its own inquiry, months earlier, establish culpable negligence in clear and specific terms, only to see 2 juries, in 2 separate trials, decline to convict anyone at all. For families who had buried children that June, the absence of a criminal verdict did not erase the finding of negligence, but it meant that no single person was ever made to answer, in a courtroom, for the decision to leave 10 carriages standing on a hill. It is perhaps for that reason that Armagh's own remembrance of the disaster has always centred less on the courts and more on the people themselves, the ones who died and the ones who tried to save them. Thomas Henry, the guard whose handbrake had failed to hold, lived the remainder of his life known, in his own town, as the man who'd been at the rear of that train, a burden the courts never formally placed on him, but that a small community rarely lets go of quietly. He gave his account of the runaway carriages, of the hedges blurring past faster than any brake van should travel, not as a defence in a courtroom, but as a plain description of what he had felt happening beneath him, and it is that account, rather than any verdict, that has survived in the record of what happened that day. Compliance did not happen overnight, and the scale of what the Act demanded became clear only once companies across Britain and Ireland began totalling the cost of it. Fitting automatic brakes to an entire fleet of locomotives and carriages was an enormous undertaking for companies that had, until that August, been free to weigh safety expenditure against every other call on their finances. Workshops across the network spent the early 1890s converting stock that had run for years, in some cases decades, without any automatic protection at all. The Great Northern Railway of Ireland itself, the company whose 11-year delay had produced the disaster in the first place, was now compelled to do, at speed and at cost, what it had declined to do voluntarily for over a decade. The Board of Trade, newly empowered to enforce rather than merely recommend, began holding every company to account for its progress toward compliance, checking on conversion to block signalling, interlocking and automatic brakes across the network. What had been before Armagh a patchwork of voluntary standards, varying company by company and line by line, became instead a single national requirement, enforced until compliance was complete. It was, in effect, the birth of railway safety as a matter of state oversight rather than private judgment, and it is the direct ancestor of the safety regulation that governs every railway operator in this country to the present day, whichever company's name happens to be painted on the side of the train. Surgeon Major John Lynn was remembered in Armagh less for any single achievement than for having been one of the first men at the wreck that morning, and for the words he gave to the newspapers describing what he found there. He had helped organise the very outing that killed so many of the children he had walked down Abbey Street alongside that morning, a fact that gave his account of the wreck its particular weight in the town afterward. The distinction between the two braking systems is, at its heart, the distinction between a device that fails dangerous and one that fails safe. A brake that must be actively maintained to stay applied will eventually fail. A brake that must be actively released to come off will not. It was this distinction, understood and named years before Armagh but never enforced, that the disaster made impossible to ignore any longer. That principle outlived the specific railway company, the specific line, and the specific carriages involved. It became, through the act that followed, one of the foundations of how every railway in Britain and Ireland was required to operate from then on. A way of thinking about danger that assumes systems will fail and asks only that they fail in the direction of safety rather than catastrophe. That same fail-safe principle sits behind the modern train protection systems fitted to trains today. Systems with names no passenger on the 12th of June 1889 could have imagined automatic warning systems that alert a driver approaching a danger signal, and automatic train protection that will apply the brakes itself if a driver fails to respond in time. Each of these systems is, in essence, a direct descendant of the same reasoning Parliament wrote into law in the 10 weeks after Armagh, that a train's safety cannot be left to depend entirely on a single person making the right decision at the right moment, because sooner or later, on some ordinary morning, that decision will not be made in time. It is a strange kind of inheritance for a small cathedral city in County Armagh to have shaped the railways of an entire country, and the automatic brake and the interlocked signal that followed it went on, in the decades after, to become standard practice on railways well beyond Britain and Ireland too. Few of the millions of passengers who board a train on any ordinary morning today have ever heard the name Armagh, and fewer still know that the brake beneath their carriage and the signal that controls the section of track ahead of them exist in their present form because of a Sunday school outing that went wrong in 1889. The remembrance gathering held each June in Armagh follows a pattern that has changed little across the decades since the memorial's unveiling. Members of the Methodist congregation, whose Sunday school organised the original excursion, gather at the sculpture on the Mall, joined by descendants of the families named on the day, by representatives of the railway that succeeded the Great Northern Railway of Ireland, and by residents of the city with no direct family connection to the disaster at all, who attend simply because the story belongs to the place they live. A short service is held, hymns are sung, and the names of those who died are read aloud in full, family by family, exactly as they were listed in the newspapers that reported the disaster in the days after it happened. It is a small ceremony by the standards of national commemoration, unhurried and largely unnoticed outside County Armagh, and that in the city itself seems to be precisely the point. The disaster was never a national event that Armagh happened to host. It was a local loss first, and the town has kept it that way, deliberately, for over a century.